thank you for the invitation. Thank you to everyone who makes this event possible. I really have to say that rarely or never have I been cared for and comforted in such a way that I've been here already. Really. Thank you so much. I feel, I'm very grateful to be here and to be among these people here. Yes, I'm gonna jump right in. I will be speaking in sequences somehow, and I guess histories that, refuse to stay still. So it's kind of a set of returns. I'm just saying that to kind of take you with me. I do not offer these pieces of sequences as evidence, but it's more of a mode of inquiry or like a practice of thinking. So that's what I kind of want to offer today. I'm departing from an island. I depart at the same time from the awareness that to name is to reclaim, to name is to claim, and to rename is to overwrite. During the time I want to recall, a name had already been imposed. The Italian conquistador sailing for the Spanish crown at the time, Christopher Columbus, declared it. In Spanish, La Española. In English, Hispaniola. This act, not incidental, was a performative assertion of colonial dominion. It was not just a marker, but an operation, a function of categorization and control. Naming was the first algorithm of conquest, and it restructured reality. To name was to encode, to inscribe land into a European linguistic system, to grab it, to override its prior existence, and reduce it to raw material for colonial inscription. Like an early form of data processing, this act sorted, classified, and optimized the world for extraction, rendering indigenous knowledges illegible within the dominant schema. Every word carries a world. The power of naming is an ability to standardize conquest as a repeatable function, a recursive logic that expanded, iterated, and refined itself over time. The world, once it was categorized, could be administered, divided, and claimed. And just as contemporary algorithms process information to produce actionable outcomes, colonial renaming an instruction set was an instruction set, an operational directive, a systematized method of making the world governable through language. Nominal violence materializes. It becomes material. Columbus' journeys are often still narrated as great myths of discovery, but discovery was always also, or solely, dispossession and death. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean on the island, specifically in early December of 1492, he did not just step onto land, he stepped onto a linguistic network, a system of names and meanings that predated his own by centuries. In the language of the then indigenous population, the Arawak-speaking Taino people, the island was called Quisqueya, which means mother of all lands, and Haiti, mountainous land, so it was basically parted. These names cannot be read as mere geographic markers, but must be understood as embedded in another framework, a relation to a geography, a relation to land. The Taino people did not stand a chance against the Spanish colonists, who befell the island in the same way imported disease did, as viral incursions into a world they sought to reprogram. By the early 16th century, only 3 decades after Columbus had first set foot on its shores, the indigenous population had been decimated due to slaughter, disease, and enslavement. As Spanish priorities shifted from sugar cultivation to mineral extraction, the island became a prototype for a colonial cybernetic system, a self-regulating network of labor, of machinery, and control. Conquest was no longer just about territorial possession. It was about designing a system that could sustain itself, that could process bodies as inputs and extract profit as output. The colony was recalibrated according to the demands of empire, optimizing extraction, refining punishment, and forcing discipline. It was feedback and loop, and feedback and loop, and feedback and loop. The plantation economy that followed was an extension of this logic, a system where labor was computed, optimized, and replaced as necessary, where the human was mechanized, and where violence was encoded into the very structure of production. Sugar mills were constructed by enslaved Canary Islanders, laying the groundwork of what would later become one of the most technologically sophisticated systems of slavery in the world. The plantation was more than just an economic system. It was an early form of algorithmic governance, a computational model where every input, labor, punishment, birth, and death, was recorded, optimized, and regulated. The plantation ledger functioned much like a database, encoding extractable value while rendering the enslaved as a quantifiable resource. As Sadia Hartman has written, this was not just discipline, it was a logic of fungibility, of making bodies interchangeable, replaceable, and disposable. The plantation encoded its subjects into a system that prefigured contemporary networks of surveillance and control. If we think of today's data regimes, predictive, policing, biometric tracking, algorithmic governance, what we see is not a break from this history, but a recursion, a refinement of its logics into digital infrastructures that, like the plantation, optimize bodies into extractable data points. By 1697, Spain ceded the western third of the island to France via the Treaty of Ryswick. Now rebranded as Saint-Domingue, the island's trajectory continued to shift under colonial rule. What emerged under French rule was a brutal cybernetic infrastructure of extraction. It recorded, categorized, and optimized human bodies into units of production. Often Haiti was called the Pearl of the Antilles, a whitewashed metaphor, ignoring the massive human price paid by the enslaved to keep the system operational. The colonial economy in the Caribbean did not merely exploit labor, it engineered an entire system in which the enslaved were more replaceable than the machines themselves. The plantation's logic of control was both biological and mechanical. It ran not just on violence, but on algorithms of surveillance, punishment, and reproductions. By 1789, Saint-Domingue supplied 60% of Europe's coffee and 40% of its sugar, and the latter's economy was dependent on the labor of over 500,000 enslaved Africans. But the system, whether we call it cybernetic or not, failed to anticipate its own contradiction. That the enslaved could not be reduced to code, that naming is never just classification but also invocation, a rupture in the given order, a speech act that calls into being. And that relation, the very thing the system sought to mechanize and control, persisted within and beyond the enforced parameters of the plantation. Fugitive networks, counter technologies of survival, possibilities that exceeded and undermined the logic of domination were formed. Between 1791 and 1804, the revolution in Saint-Domingue was carried forward through a vast and volatile network of insurgents, enslaved people, maroons, free non-white peoples, sailors, stockworkers, and revolutionary agitators. They all moved between plantations, port cities, and political spheres, carrying news, tactics, and insurrectionary ideas. Together, they overthrew the local planter class and dismantled the entire racial capitalist order of European colonialism at the time. By declaring independence in 1804, Haiti became the first Black republic, and by that, it redefined political sovereignty on its own terms. The revolution shattered the plantation economy, expelled the French military, and forced the world to reckon with a new paradigm of freedom. One that was really fought for, carried across winds and waters, dispersed through relation and rebellion. This is a very brief account of events, and it is necessarily reductive, of course. Its purpose is to hallmark the island's succession of names, Quisqueya and Haiti, Hispaniola, Saint-Domingue, Pearl of Antilles, Haiti. Naming, no matter how violently opposed, is never final. It vibrates, it lingers, and it shifts. It is a struggle over the terms of existence. Each rechristening sought to overwrite the past, but traces persisted. The Taino Batai, which were ceremonial plazas from the indigenous people, buried under sugar plantations, the Creole world Haiti resurfacing in 1804 as a declaration of indigenous and African continuity. The survival of languages, names, rhythms, ways to communicate, encrypted in drumming and plantation telegraphy, smuggled across oceans and time. The symptomatology and symbolism for and of this era persevere. In a 2023 keynote lecture titled The Fugitive and the Fugitive, Fred Moten began, with a reference to Duke Ellington's 1956 musical composition, A Drum is a Woman. From there, he carried the audience to the story of Henry Clay, who was a 100-year-old ex-slave interviewed as part of a federal writers' project in the 1930s. In his narration, Clay speaks about a whipping machine, a term prominently featured by another person in another book that is called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, by Edward E. Baptiste. In this book, torture is not an incidental cruelty, but an industrialized systemic mechanism of labor extraction. It is established and conceived of as a central factor of US American capitalist production. It is technology. Many names all gathered here in the parameters of history so violent that the present moment makes perfect sense. Out of the whipping machine comes the drum, Moten says. Out of the whipping machine comes the drum. I will stay with Henry Clay, and I quote, "Old master was awfully kind and religious. I think he would preach a little sometimes or maybe teach Sunday school. I never seen him whip a slave, but he had a whipping machine to scare them with mostly. The whipping machine was a funny thing. Old master just had it set around so the slaves could see it, I think. He loaned it out to a man one time, though, and the man used it. It was a big wooden wheel with a treadle to it, and when you trumped the treadle, the big wheel go round. On that wheel was 4 or 5 big leather straps with holes cut in them to make blisters, and you lay the Negro down on his face on a bench and tie him to it and set the machine close to him. Then when you trumped the treadle, the wheel go round and flop them straps across his bare back and raise the skin. Getting him strapped down on that bench had him cured long before you had to trump the treadle." Casualness as casualty, treadle, wheel, leather straps, trumping the treadle, rhythmically, repeatedly, relentlessly. The description of horror arrives conversationally, so unembellished that its brutality stands unshaken, untouchable by overstatement. The contrasting implies a dissonance, fuming of a lifetime of normalized violence. Clay describes the mechanics of the machine, its operation, its ritualistic repetition, and almost banal technicality to a process designed for terror. But the old master was awfully kind and religious, and the whipping machine was just one of the many things standing around as to be expected in a world of chattel and plantation enslavement. Violence was always. The plantation, a machine of machines regulating labor, optimizing extraction, enforcing control. The whipping machine was not an aberration, it was an extension of the plantation's operational logic, an automation of punishment designed to condition the body before a single blow was even struck. Clay's description reveals not only the violence of the whipping machine, but its structuring force, how it disciplined not only through pain, but through the sheer fact of its presence, through the way it rendered suffering an inevitability. The machine did not have to be in motion to function. It governed through its potential, its display, its silent command. This is technology. The treadle, the straps, the repetition, a mechanization of punishment, a system that optimized coercion and control. If this machine prefigures anything, it is not a direct analogy to digital infrastructures, but a logic of power that persists across time and space. It transforms violence into process, subjugation into system. Out of the whipping machine comes the drum. Moten's refrain gestures towards an afterlife of sound, a sonic transformation of violence into fugitivity. The whipping machine was itself a rhythmic instrument, a mechanical, percussive structure that marked time and discipline, suffering and control. The straps striking flesh, the measured interval of treadles release and return, the repetitive sequencing, all of it constituted an enforced rhythm that inscribed terror onto the body in time and tempo in the logic of forced synchronization. Rhythm is not neutral. If the whip could produce rhythm, then so could other forms of sonic expression, so could the drum. If the machine could condition movement, reaction, response, then rhythm too could condition relation, recognition, and resistance. The drum, like the whip, was a technology of inscription, but one of counter-communication, of encrypted relation. While the whipping machine was a structure of domination that disciplined the body into submission, the drum was a fugitive code, an instrument of escape, a transmission of movement across space and time. It is time to think through and make sense of the technological sophistication within the cultural subversions of those whose timelines have been constantly and cruelly shaped by systems of domination, uprooting, and annihilation. And there are still those who persistently imagine and enact and act otherwise. In Édouard Glissant's 1989 work, Caribbean Discourse, he states, "From the outset, that is, from the moment Creole is forged as a medium of communication between slave and master, the spoken imposes on the slave its particular syntax. For Caribbean men, the world is first and foremost sound. Noise is essential to speech. Din is discourse. This must be understood." It seems that meaning and pitch went together for the uprooted individual in the unrelenting silence of the world of slavery. It was the intensity of the sound that dictated meaning. The pitch of the sound conferred significance. Ideas were bracketed. One person could make himself understood through the subtle association of sound in which the master, so capable of managing basic Creole in other situations, got hopelessly lost. Creole spoken by the Beques was never shouted or out loud. Since speech was forbidden, slaves camouflaged the word under the provocative intensity of the scream. No one could translate the meaning of what seemed to be nothing but a shout. It was taken to be nothing but the call of a wild animal. This is how the dispossessed man organized his speech, by weaving it into the apparently meaningless texture of extreme noise. In the face of an imposed silence as part of a system of total dehumanization, enslaved people developed forms of expression that were deeply rooted in sound, rhythm, and oral communication, all practices that are shaped by the material and social conditions of enslavement. These sonic practices, including the early formation of Creole languages, emerged in contexts of extreme linguistic diversity and structural violence. While Creole as a linguistic system would solidify over generations, its origins and the broader centrality of sound to the enslaved life underscore that language cannot be understood solely as a semantical or grammatical structure. When noise is essential to speech and dinless discourse, audibility and inaudibility become political. And when direct speech is mostly forbidden, screams, noise, and seemingly meaningless sound all become necessary as a form of covert communication. Discourse is camouflaged, only wild animals to be heard. The use of pitch and intensity to bracket meaning is analog to modulation in signal processing, which adds complexity to an apparently simple message so that it could be deciphered only by those with a shared knowledge to understand it. Here, forms of encoding and encryption appear as spoken word. Sound is leveraged to reclaim a position, agency to somehow be in community. Noise is discourse, because noise is discourse. Clay's invocation of the whipping machine aligns with Baptiste's argument that torture was not an excess of the plantation system, but one of its central mechanisms, a necessary element in the economic expansion and industrialization of the United States. It describes, in its cold efficiency, the transition of the plantation from an enterprise of raw coercion to an enterprise of industrialized human management, which is, after all, a shift that laid the groundwork for all modern logistical and computational regimes. I'm making a simple yet profound assertion with the two histories that I invoked. Language is technology. This is not a metaphor. It is a statement and a conviction about materiality, about world making, and about the everyday experience of how we are in life. There's a terminological and conceptual urgency, I would say, in our contemporary world to address technology not simply as a practical, utilitarian, or positivist category, but as something that underpins and transforms our conditions of existence. Technology is not an addendum to human life, as it structures how life is organized, felt, and understood. I seek to think through and with it, now and in this context, precisely because the way we conceive of technology reveals much about the structures of our societies and the power dynamics that they embed and that are embedded. The power to create technology has historically been restricted, bound to systems of exclusion and domination. Language itself has been weaponized and domesticated, reduced to an instrument of exchange. At this juncture, precisely, lies the ideological weight of technology. lies in its power to divide and order, and it begins with the question of what even counts as technology in the first place. The boundary between technology as natural and technology as fabricated or artificial is a social construct that restricts invention, defines who gets to create and who must use, and determines which voices innovate and which are confined to only echo. Technology, in its most fundamental sense, is a language of relations. To understand technology expansively is not just a theoretical or conceptual shift, it is a political act. It is a social act. It means unraveling histories and reconfiguring whose voices get to shape the present and the future. The tension between expanding technology as I do it to encompass its embodied and relational and liberatory dimensions while simultaneously relying on its narrow and conventional usage is not a contradiction to resolve, but truly a dynamic for all of us always to inhabit and work through. It reflects the recursive nature of language itself. Concepts like languages, I think, have their times and spaces, that is, specific conditions that make their emergence possible in a different way. The conditions of our present demand that we conceive of language as technology. To understand the everyday experience of technological life, it is required to account for the multiplicity of histories, of personas, positionalities, and materialities that shape our world. The everyday has never been simply lived. It has always been technologically mediated. In Ursula Le Guin's 2005 short essay, A Rant About Technology, she writes, "It's technology, how a society copes with physical reality. Technology is the active human interface with the material world. Technology and high tech are not synonymous, and a technology that isn't high isn't necessarily low in any meaningful sense. Low technology," and the prefix literally implies history, right? So low technology represents a form of human ingenuity that is not less sophisticated, simply because it does not align with high-tech or industrial era innovations, of which, the whipping machine was literally one, and also metaphorically. Rather, it is a recognition that technology contains all practical applications of human knowledge to mediate the relationships and relations between humans and the material world. These low technologies take different forms that embody ways of knowing and interfacing with reality that resist being categorized solely, and that is what is the case, solely by colonial and industrial and digital standards. What makes technological advancements sophisticated and meaningful are precisely their specificity and context, their ability to let us navigate these material realities. A true measure of progress, then, cannot be constituted just through the gadgets we build, but must be also grounded in how we relate to each other in relation. The metal and silicon circuits that power our devices are as essential as the circuits of story and history, those that bring meaning to technologies in the first place, those that might also move us forward. If language is technology, then machinic language is one of its most distilled and operationalized forms. A system that does not speak but predicts, does not listen but calculates. Algorithmic infrastructures, from natural language processing to generative AI, do not interpret meaning. They model probability. What does it mean for meaning itself to be statistical? Many disciplines and fields and people have long accounted for the ways in which language, inscription, and representation are mediated by technology. But have we always listened? Have we accounted for the sonic landscapes of the plantation, to the coded rhythms of resistance and the ways language itself was forged? The contradiction is this: we recognize the computational logics of control, but not always the technological ingenuity of refusal. Machinic language emerges from our histories, its contingencies and fractures. It does not simply erase meaning, it remediates it through structures of optimization, collapsing ambiguity into predictability, opacity into legibility. But what cannot be so easily processed, what remains illegible to the machine? Resistance, too, is a form of measurement. And the histories of sonic, linguistic, and technological practice have never been fully legible to dominant systems. Never. It is precisely their survival. The reason for that is precisely their survival. If words have always been world-making, what happens when speech is no longer an act but an output? When machinic language does not replace human language but reorganizes its condition of possibility? To call this a fascist operating system is not hyperbole. It is an attempt to name the enclosure of language within systems of extractive computation. Participation in digital infrastructures now demands submission to their terms, their classifications, their constraints. The software does not just update, it updates us. The multidisciplinary artist Sol Williams spoke to that precisely. And I wanted to show you the video, but it will probably not work properly, so I will just read the quote. But I urge you to look it up because it's quite powerful, how he kind of, evocatively and affectively speaks about it. So what he says is this: when we look at modern devices, as long as they are dependent on those unnamed workforces in the Congo, as long as they are dependent on all of these resources, I'm not impressed with that as technology. Because technology is supposed to move us forward, not continue some sort of analog exploitation that has gone on ever since. And so the technology that we represent through poetry, through coding, language, it can be ignored. It can be slept on. It can be renamed slam. It can be renamed spoken word. You can call it whatever the fuck you want. To navigate this moment is not simply to critique it. It is to insist that language remains. It remains a site of struggle, a site of fugitivity, a site of possibility. This is an urgent insistence, a demand to rethink what constitutes the everyday experience of technological life. Technology has never only been about machinery or industrial progress, but always about systems of survival, about world making, about how we relate, not just to tools, but to each other. To reckon with technology is to reckon with the intangibles, with sound, rhythm, language, with their function as technology. They are part of a continuum of a different, sometimes a black as I recalled it, but just a different technological resourcefulness and imagination that has always remade communication and information under conditions of constraint. I have presented a way to follow the noise that history leaves behind. And if technology is an ongoing negotiation of power, then so too must be our engagement with it. Not to make progress, but to progress collectively. Thank you.